A single coin passed from a market in Mesopotamia to an altar in Greece, carrying more than silver. This is the story of the exchange networks that connected temples, markets, and myths. By the end, you will understand how ancient trade routes built the modern world, weaving together the sacred and the commercial. We will uncover how a merchant's vow could spread a new god, and why a story about a flood hero appears in cultures thousands of miles apart. What invisible threads still tie our beliefs to our purchases today? At the temple gate, a merchant offers a bundle of fragrant spices, not just for sale, but as a gift to the gods. This single act blurs a line we often take for granted, the line between the sacred and the everyday. In the ancient world, these spheres were not separate. The temple was not only a house of prayer, it was a storehouse of wealth and an early form of a bank. The market was not just a place of commerce, it was a stage where myths were performed and gods were introduced to new audiences. Historians like Peter Frankopan point to this deep, symbiotic relationship. Trade routes carried more than silk and spices, they carried the very ideas that defined civilizations. A creation myth from Mesopotamia could travel along a caravan route, finding a home in a new land and transforming a local story into a universal legend. Think of your own local market not as a modern supermarket, but as a bustling square where, centuries ago, you might have encountered a deity from a distant culture as easily as you would a new type of fruit. This constant interplay of belief and barter allowed cultures to expand their influence, weaving a shared tapestry of human experience across vast and unknown frontiers. That volcanic glass wrapped with care was more than a tool, it was a promise. Across thousands of years, these first trade routes were not mere paths of commerce. They were the earliest conversations between distant human societies. The amber route stretched from the cold Baltic shores to the warm Mediterranean, a river of fossilized sunlight flowing south. This golden material was not merely pretty, it was believed to be solidified sunbeams capturing the very essence of a powerful deity. At the same time, from the volcanic highlands of Anatolia came the deep, dark sheen of obsidian. This glass, sharper than any metal for millennia, was linked to chthonic powers, the gods of the earth and the world below. These materials did not travel alone. They carried their stories with them. Archaeology reveals the final destinations of these journeys. A cache of Baltic amber found in a Mycenaean tomb, a piece of Anatolian obsidian resting in a Mesopotamian temple hoard. These were not random finds, they show a clear, deliberate pattern. An object began its life as a commodity, traded through a complex system of barter and trusted relationships. A trader might exchange that piece of obsidian for rare seashells. Those shells would then travel further, to be strung into a necklace for a priestess hundreds of miles from the sea. But something profound happened when these objects arrived at a temple. Their value transformed. A piece of amber was no longer just a trinket to be bartered. In the dim light of a shrine, it became a piece of the sun itself, a physical fragment of divine power. Its economic worth was now inseparable from its spiritual significance. This transformation is the key to understanding these ancient networks. The route itself became a sacred passage, and the object a vessel for belief. The people who managed these exchanges were more than merchants. They were intermediaries in every sense, trusted not only with goods but with the potent symbols those goods represented. They laid a foundation of connection that would, over centuries, allow for something even more complex to travel, not just precious stones but entire stories. Not just shells, but systems of belief. These silent, Stone Age trails were the first threads in a web that would eventually carry gods and heroes across the known world. The storyteller's voice rose and fell with the cadence of a tale told 1,000 times before, a narrative of a great flood and a single hero saved by a boat. To the merchants gathered at the caravan stop, the story was both comfortingly familiar and strangely new. They had heard echoes of it in other lands, with different names for the hero and his vessel. This was the hidden cargo of the trade routes, the myths themselves traveling as mobile commodities. As merchants moved, their oral traditions became as portable and valuable as the goods they carried. A legend from one culture could be adapted, its local specifics softened to resonate with a new audience, its core message preserved like a precious seed planted in foreign soil. Scholars like Walter Burkert have mapped the astonishing journeys of these mythological motifs. The figure of the dragon-slaying hero, for instance, appears in countless forms from ancient Mesopotamia to the farthest reaches of Eurasia. This was not a case of independent invention, but of deliberate transmission. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the mighty king of Uruk, provides a stunningly clear example. This Mesopotamian story traveled west along the trade routes to the Levant and eventually to the shores of Greece. There, over centuries, the figure of Gilgamesh, with his immense strength and his quest for immortality, slowly transformed. He became Heracles, the Greek hero who also performed impossible labors and battled monsters. The story was not copied, it was translated, culturally and linguistically, to make sense in its new home. This process relied on a special kind of traveler, the multilingual merchant who acted as a cultural translator. These individuals did more than negotiate prices, they negotiated meaning. A merchant might hear a local legend about a mountain god in one town, and weeks later share a simplified version of that story at another stop, perhaps comparing that god to a deity from his own homeland. This was a practical necessity. To build trust and facilitate trade, it was often useful to find common ground, to show respect for the local spirits and powers. A merchant far from home might begin by cautiously invoking a foreign deity for protection on a dangerous mountain pass. Over time, as trade relations deepened, that foreign god might be invited in, given a small shrine in a port city, and slowly woven into the local pantheon. This was not merely spiritual curiosity, it was a strategic business practice that created a shared cultural framework. Why did certain myths like the flood or the dragon slayer resonate so universally? Perhaps because they addressed fundamental human fears and aspirations, concerns that transcended any single culture. Trade did not create these deep-seated stories, but it provided the pathways for their adoption, allowing a narrative from one river valley to find a home in another, thousands of miles away. The mobility of these stories wove a shared tapestry of human imagination, one where a hero from one land could become a legend in another, all because a merchant needed to tell a good story at a campfire. The gleaming marble of the Parthenon was far more than a monument to a goddess. It was the central bank of Athens, its stone vaults holding not just golden statues but the financial lifeblood of the city-state. Across the ancient world, temples like this were the beating hearts of economic life, their sacred authority underpinning a revolutionary system of trust and credit. They were the first institutions to master the flow of capital, transforming agricultural surplus into tradable wealth. Within the vast temple complexes of Uruk and Babylon, priestly accountants meticulously recorded harvests of grain and wool on clay tablets, managing a divine portfolio that funded everything from public festivals to military fleets. A merchant seeking to finance a risky sea voyage could approach the temple not just for a prayer but for a loan. The contract would be sealed with a sacred vow, a promise made before the gods themselves, making the agreement far more binding than any mere human document. This divine guarantee was the cornerstone of the system. Faith in the gods created trust in the transaction. A merchant might pledge a generous portion of his future profits to the temple treasury, a spiritual investment that also served as a form of divine insurance for his journey. This created a powerful cycle. The temple's wealth grew from these successful ventures, and its increased resources allowed it to fund even more ambitious trade expeditions. These expeditions, in turn, carried the name and the myths of the temple's patron deity to new ports and markets. Think of it as an ancient form of branding. When a ship funded by the Temple of Poseidon sailed into a foreign harbor, it did not just carry goods, it carried the story of the sea shaker himself. The economic power of the temple directly fueled the spread of its associated beliefs, weaving its mythology into the very fabric of long-distance trade. The sacred and the commercial were not just allies, they were two sides of the same coin, minted within the temple walls. A statue of Hermes, crafted from bronze, stood at the entrance to the agora in Corinth, his eyes seeming to follow the endless flow of humanity. This was not a quiet place of contemplation, but a vibrant, noisy stage where the world's goods and stories collided. The marketplace was the ultimate mythological crossroads, a living theater where belief was constantly performed, bartered, and remade. Here, a merchant from Phoenicia might not just sell fine purple cloth. He would perform the power of his god Baal, recounting dramatic tales of storms and fertility to entice buyers and lend his wares an air of divine favor. Next to him, a storyteller, perhaps a retired sailor, would captivate a crowd with an embellished version of a hero's journey, adding a monster from a foreign land he had once visited. This constant, dynamic interaction was a forge for new myths. Anthropologists like Claude Lévi-Strauss observed that such contact zones naturally lead to a process called syncretism, the blending of different cultural traditions. In bustling port cities, this was an everyday reality. The Egyptian goddess Isis, a powerful figure of magic and motherhood, met the Greek goddess Demeter, the nurturer of the harvest. To a Greek merchant living in Alexandria, these two powerful maternal figures began to merge in the public imagination, creating a composite deity who offered comfort to people far from home. This was not a formal theological decision, but an organic, grassroots fusion born from shared human needs in a multicultural space. Myths were also a practical tool for commerce. A merchant selling amulets would not simply claim they were well-made. He would insist they were blessed by a specific deity, their power woven into the very material. A festival for a local god was not just a spiritual event. It was a major economic driver, drawing pilgrims who became customers, their faith fueling the market's vitality. Why did this environment prove so fertile for mythological innovation? The marketplace was a realm of pure potential, a space where old certainties were challenged by new connections and where the need to communicate across cultures demanded the creation of shared stories. In the haggling over spices and the sharing of tales, the gods themselves were quietly, constantly being reinvented. A caravan emerges from the shimmering heat of the Taklamakan desert, its precious silks shimmering not only with color but with meaning. Woven into the fabric are scenes from Buddhist parables, while embroidered on a saddlebag is a Zoroastrian symbol of a winged disc. This was the true nature of the Silk Road, a highway where merchandise and myth were inseparable traveling companions. While spices, jade, and glass moved along these routes, the most transformative cargo was often intangible, a flood of new beliefs and legends flowing from China to the Mediterranean. This network became the primary conduit for the spread of Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. each religion carrying its own rich universe of stories, heroes, and divine beings into new lands. At the heart of this exchange were the oasis towns, thriving hubs where caravans stopped to rest and resupply. Historians like Valerie Hansen show us that these were not just pit stops, they were vibrant cultural cauldrons. In places like Dunhuang, a crossroads on the edge of the desert, merchant wealth funded the creation of breathtaking cave temples. These caves became a preserved library of mythological art, where the serene face of the Buddha could be found alongside local nature spirits and deities from half a dozen traditions. The walls themselves tell a story of fusion, of how the story of the Buddha's previous lives, the Jataka tales, merged with local shamanic traditions, creating a new, hybrid form of spirituality that felt both familiar and exotic to the people of the region. The translation of sacred texts was another critical engine of this mythological exchange. Traveling monks, often funded by pious merchants, would spend years in these oasis towns, meticulously translating Buddhist sutras from Sanskrit into Chinese, Sogdian, and other local languages. This was not a simple word-for-word translation. It was a process of cultural adaptation. A mythical beast from an Indian text might be described using the name and attributes of a similar creature from Chinese folklore, allowing the new story to resonate more deeply with its audience. The Chinese dragon, for instance, began to absorb characteristics from other mythical serpents as its image traveled west into Persian art, evolving with each new interpretation. On a more personal level, mythology served as a practical tool for commerce. A Sogdian trader, the master merchants of Central Asia, might not just haggle over the price of a bolt of cloth. He could use a well-timed tale from the Indian epic, the Ramayana, to illustrate a point about honor or a promise kept. In doing so, he was not merely telling a story, he was building a bridge of shared understanding between Indian and Central Asian cultures. This shared story created a moment of connection, a common ground that made a business agreement feel more like a pact between allies. The Silk Road did not just transport distant myths, it actively wove them into a common heritage. By dissolving cultural barriers through commerce, it allowed for the birth of entirely new hybrid beliefs, proving that the most enduring cargo is often the story that travels with the goods. Beyond the edge of the known world, a Phoenician ship sailed past the Pillars of Hercules, its cargo a mix of crimson dye and whispered tales of leviathans lurking in the deep. These maritime routes were the lifeblood of mythological exchange, carrying gods and goods across the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean with every tide. Sailors were the primary agents of this transfer, their very survival dependent on understanding and placating the forces of the sea. A sudden storm was not just bad weather, it was the wrath of Poseidon, while a calm passage might be attributed to the benevolence of an ancient goddess like Tiamat. These stories were practical tools, a way to explain the unexplainable and impose a narrative of order upon a chaotic and unforgiving environment. The findings of nautical archaeology provide stunning proof of this fusion. Shipwrecks from this era are time capsules, revealing statues of gods and protective amulets nestled securely beside amphorae of wine and ingots of copper. The spiritual and the commercial were packed together in the same hold. Maritime historian Peregrine Horden emphasizes how coastal temples served dual purposes. Their fires burned as lighthouses, guiding ships to safety, while their priests acted as early ethnographers, recording the foreign myths and strange deities described by sailors from distant ports. This created a feedback loop of belief. A temple dedicated to a local sea god would, over generations, accumulate tales and attributes from a dozen different cultures, slowly evolving into a more universal figure of maritime protection. Consider the powerful journey of the Egyptian goddess Isis. Her cult did not spread through conquest alone. It traveled on the very grain ships that fed the city of Rome. Roman sailors and merchants, encountering her worship in Egyptian ports, adopted her as a protector of seafarers and brought her back to Italy, where her temples soon offered solace to people far from home. A similar process unfolded across the Indian Ocean. Hindu merchants established trade colonies throughout Southeast Asia, and with them came the great Indian epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Local rulers in places like Java and Cambodia adopted these stories, weaving them into their own cultural identity and commissioning massive temple complexes carved with scenes from these foreign narratives. For an individual merchant, this was a deeply personal calculus. Facing a long and dangerous voyage, it made practical sense to pray to every potentially helpful power. A trader might begin a journey offering a vow to his hometown god, but upon reaching a new port, he would quickly learn the name of the local sea deity and add that entity to his prayers. This was not a crisis of faith, but an expansion of it, a spiritual insurance policy for a perilous profession. Why does the sea inspire such universal themes of monsters, chaos, and divine guardians? Perhaps because it represented the ultimate frontier, a place of both immense opportunity and unimaginable risk. These aquatic highways did not just move merchandise, they dissolved the barriers between pantheons, allowing a prayer uttered in one language to find an answer in the myth of another. That owl stamped on the silver stater was more than a symbol of Athens. It was the unblinking eye of the goddess herself, watching over every transaction. Coins became the most portable and powerful medium for spreading myth, miniature metal canvases that carried divine iconography directly into the hands of people across vast empires. This was not just currency, it was state-sanctioned storytelling. Rulers quickly understood that to mint a coin was to broadcast a message, and the most potent message of all was a direct link to the gods. When Alexander the Great issued coins depicting himself with the ram's horns of Zeus Ammon, he was not merely celebrating a military victory. He was making a theological claim, fusing his own image with that of a supreme deity to legitimize his rule over both Greek and Egyptian subjects. Numismatists like David Sear trace how these small, durable objects acted as missionaries for mythology. A Roman denarius might feature the facade of a temple, reminding its holder of the state's piety with every purchase. Far to the east, Indian punch-marked coins carried the earliest symbols of Buddhism, like the elephant and the tree, spreading the Buddha's teachings through commercial exchange. For a trader in Anatolia, accepting a coin stamped with the image of an unfamiliar Egyptian god was a simple economic necessity. But through repetition, that strange figure with an animal head became a little less foreign, its story slowly seeping into the local consciousness. The material value of the coin, its weight in precious metal, lent tangible power to the image it bore. The trust placed in the silver or gold was subtly transferred to the deity depicted upon it, enhancing the perceived authority of both the myth and the minting ruler. This monetization of myth did more than spread stories, it helped standardize them. Across a diverse empire, a single coin type could present a unified version of a god or a hero, creating a shared visual language that transcended local dialects and traditions. The marketplace, the temple, and the mint had converged, turning every transaction into a potential act of cultural and spiritual exchange. A Hittite king sends a golden statue to an Egyptian pharaoh, a gift that gleams with more than just metal. It carries a story, a carefully chosen myth about its divine origins meant to be read aloud in a foreign court. This was ritual exchange, a sophisticated language of diplomacy where precious objects served as vessels for shared belief. The Amarna letters, a cache of ancient diplomatic correspondence, reveal this world in stunning detail. Kings did not merely trade gold and lapis lazuli, they exchanged ceremonial weapons inscribed with epic tales and sacred stones believed to house fragments of divine power. Anthropologist Marcel Mauss called this the spirit of the gift, an unspoken moral obligation woven into the transaction. The object itself was almost secondary to the powerful narrative it carried, a narrative that bound giver and receiver in a relationship far deeper than a simple trade agreement. This system relied on a special class of envoys, often high priests or royal scribes, who were trusted not only with the physical safety of the treasure, but with the accurate transmission of its accompanying myth. A misstated detail about a god could insult an ally as deeply as a shorted payment of gold. We see this pattern across the ancient world. City-states would exchange cult statues, not as acts of religious conversion, but as a way of welcoming a foreign deity into a local pantheon, a divine ambassador to cement a political alliance. Centuries later, the gifting of relics like the Buddha's tooth followed these same ancient pathways of ritual exchange, carrying spiritual authority across Asia. This practice also provided a mythological justification for the flow of tribute from a weaker kingdom to a stronger one. A payment of timber and copper could be reframed not as an act of submission, but as a sacred offering to the emperor's patron deity, a myth that preserved dignity while fulfilling a practical demand. The most profound integration occurred when a receiving kingdom, to honor a powerful ally, would incorporate the donor's hero or god into its own annual festivals. A foreign name would be spoken in local prayers, a strange story would be enacted in a public square, slowly weaving a new thread into the cultural fabric. Why did a myth make a gift of ivory more binding than one of simple gold? Because the story created a shared universe of meaning. It transformed a political deal into a sacred pact, witnessed not just by kings, but by the gods whose tales were now held in common. This ritual trade built a fragile web of international relations, one where belief was the strongest currency of all. The merchant's knife was swift, and the animal's life was offered not just on an altar, but over a clay tablet detailing a shipment of copper. This solemn act transformed a simple business deal into a sacred covenant, witnessed and enforced by the gods themselves. Across the ancient world, shared mythological beliefs provided the essential moral and legal framework that made long-distance trade possible. Without international laws or reliable policing, trust had to be divinely guaranteed. Historical records from Bronze Age treaties are filled with vivid curses, calling upon a pantheon of deities to punish anyone who broke the terms. A Hittite king might invoke a dozen gods to bring drought, famine, and the loss of his line to any partner who betrayed their oath. This was not mere superstition. It was a sophisticated system of psychological and spiritual leverage, blending commerce with the very real fear of divine retribution. Scholars like Karen Radner point to Assyrian trade contracts that were explicitly placed under the protection of their chief god, Ashur. To violate such an agreement was not merely a breach of contract, it was a direct affront to a divine king, risking supernatural consequences that no court could ever match. The mechanisms for this integration were both practical and profound. Temple courts served as the earliest international trade tribunals, where priests adjudicated disputes not by a written legal code, but by mythological precedents. What would the god Shamash, who represented justice and the sun, deem fair in this case? The verdict was seen as the deity's own will. Meanwhile, merchants themselves carried small talismans or seals depicting gods like Hermes, the divine messenger and patron of commerce. These were not just good luck charms, They were portable symbols of divine authority, signaling to any potential trading partner that this individual was under the protection of a powerful enforcer of oaths. A broken promise, therefore, was an insult to that deity, inviting a wrath that transcended human punishment. This system profoundly reduced the need for complex legal bureaucracies. Why invest in an extensive police force when every merchant believed that the gods themselves were watching the scales? Faith in these shared myths created a powerful deterrent against dishonesty, fostering a baseline of trust that allowed strangers from different cultures and languages to do business. It was a form of spiritual insurance that made the risky venture of long-distance trade not just feasible but sacred. The marketplace was not lawless. It was a space where myth served as the ultimate legal authority, binding people together not through force, but through a shared belief in the powers that governed their world. A dusty pilgrim on the road to Santiago pays for his meal not with coin, but with a handful of salt carried from his distant village. These sacred journeys were economic engines in disguise, where every step taken in faith also moved the wheels of commerce. Pilgrimage routes formed one of the most resilient exchange networks in history, seamlessly blending the spiritual and the mercantile. Paths leading to sites like Varanasi, Mecca, or Delphi were not quiet trails of solitary reflection. They were bustling corridors lined with markets and hostels that sprang up to serve the constant flow of travelers. A pilgrim needed food, shelter, and safe passage, and meeting these needs created a thriving economy that stretched for hundreds of miles. Historians like Diana Eck highlight how these routes enabled the spread of religious myths not through conquest, but through travelogues and souvenirs. A pilgrim returning from a long journey would bring back more than a blessing. They carried new stories, innovative tools, and different ways of seeing the world. Consider the Hajj, the annual Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca. For centuries, caravans from across Africa and Asia converged on the city, their routes predetermined by faith. These were not just groups of worshippers, they were massive mobile trade delegations. A merchant from Mali might travel with the pilgrim caravan, funding his spiritual journey by trading gold and ivory along the way. In this context, Islamic narratives and legal concepts spread organically into new regions, carried by pilgrims who also acted as cultural ambassadors. Similarly, the journeys of Buddhist monks like Xuanzang were monumental undertakings funded by trade. Xuanzang did not travel empty-handed. He carried artifacts and scriptures, and he traded for supplies and safe passage, effectively bartering religious knowledge for material sustenance. His detailed accounts of the lands he visited became invaluable guides, not just for future pilgrims, but for merchants seeking new opportunities. At the local level, the infrastructure of faith fueled this cycle. Temples and monasteries built hostels and authorized markets near their gates, creating sacred cities that depended on pilgrim traffic. The sale of relics, whether small fragments of bone or vials of holy water, provided the necessary funds for both the institutions and the pilgrims themselves. Why did these specific journeys amplify the reach of local myths so effectively? A pilgrimage is an act of profound personal transformation, and the stories learned along such a path carry the weight of that experience. A creation myth heard from a fellow traveler at a wayside shrine becomes entangled with the memory of struggle and devotion, making it far more potent and memorable. Pilgrimage networks turned abstract faith into a tangible, mobile commodity, ensuring that the most powerful stories always found a way to travel. A simple clay pot in a Roman market, painted with the image of Hercules wrestling the Nemean lion, was far more than a container. It was a promise of strength and resilience, a piece of a hero's legend that a customer could bring into their own home. This was mythological branding, an ancient practice where artisans and merchants deliberately linked their products to powerful divine narratives to increase their appeal and value. The exchange networks we have followed did not just transport these myths, they standardized them, creating a shared visual language that savvy sellers could leverage. Archaeologists uncover this strategy everywhere, from delicate cosmetics jars adorned with the face of Aphrodite, promising beauty and allure, to sturdy blacksmith tools etched with the symbol of Hephaestus, guaranteeing superior craftsmanship. Marketing historians like Robert Fitzgerald point to this as the origin of brand loyalty. A customer in Athens, faced with a choice between two similar bolts of cloth, would instinctively gravitate towards the one whose dye was said to be blessed by the gods of Tyre, its deep purple hue a color of legend and royalty. Far to the east, Chinese silk was not sold merely as a luxurious fabric. It was marketed with enchanting tales of celestial weavers, implying that the material itself was of divine origin, spun from moonlight and cloud. The strategy was multifaceted. Mythological motifs were not just stamped on the product itself, but on its packaging. An amphora of wine might be sealed with an image of Dionysus, and the very crate it was shipped in could be branded with scenes from his joyful processions. Merchants were trained in the art of storytelling, learning to weave a concise, compelling version of a myth into their sales pitch. Why did this approach work so powerfully across different cultures and languages? The image of a hero or a god transcended linguistic barriers. A buyer did not need to speak Latin to understand the promise of victory in a sword whose blade was engraved with the story of Mars. That universal symbol conveyed quality, power, and divine favor instantly. This ancient marketing genius transformed everyday goods into vessels of cultural narrative, where every purchase allowed a person to own a small piece of a much larger story. That merchant's pouch held both a list of goods and a piece of the cosmos, a cuneiform tablet inscribed with the Epic of Gilgamesh resting beside a simple bill of lading. The invention of writing did not just record history, it transformed the very nature of exchange, giving myths a permanent body and contracts an unbreakable spine. For the first time, a story could travel thousands of miles without a single word being changed, its heroes and gods arriving in a distant land exactly as they had left their homeland. This was a revolution in portability. Scripts like the versatile Phoenician alphabet or the precise Sanskrit of the Indian subcontinent became the vehicles for this new kind of cargo. They allowed complex mythological texts to be standardized, copied, and sent along trade routes with the same efficiency as a shipment of olive oil or incense. Scholar Jack Goody noted a fascinating duality in this process. Writing could demystify a story, pulling it from the intimate, variable realm of oral performance and fixing it into a single, authoritative version. Yet this same act of preservation turned myths into stable commodities, objects that could be owned, traded, and accumulated as a form of cultural capital. The architects of this transformation were the scribes, the learned individuals who worked in the shadows of temples and the bustling corners of markets. In Mesopotamia, a temple scribe might spend his morning meticulously copying a religious epic onto a series of clay tablets, destined for a library in a trading colony far to the north. In the afternoon, he could be recording a legally binding contract for a caravan master, the terms of the deal sealed with invocations to the same gods celebrated in the epic he had just transcribed. These scribes were more than clerks, they were cultural engineers. They ensured that a copy of the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, was as recognizable in Anatolia as it was in Babylon itself. At border crossings and in port cities, stelae inscribed with local laws and founding myths served to educate and intimidate traveling merchants, imparting the cultural norms of the host kingdom the moment they arrived. Consider the profound journey of the Hebrew Bible. Its scrolls did not spread through military conquest alone. They traveled along established trade networks, carried by Jewish merchants to diaspora communities established in commercial hubs from Rome to Alexandria. In these foreign cities, the written word became an anchor for identity, a portable homeland preserved on parchment. The authority of these written myths in commercial life was immense. An oral tale could be doubted or reshaped by a skeptical listener, but a contract or a sacred text inscribed on a durable medium carried the weight of tangible truth. In a dispute between two merchants from different cultures, a written agreement, perhaps even one that called upon a shared deity for witness, was far more compelling than a remembered promise. Writing turned the fluid, evolving stories of the campfire into fixed, tradable assets. A myth written on a scroll had a definable value. It could be sold to a temple, gifted to a king, or used as collateral. The exchange networks now carried a new, powerful currency, the immutable word, and with it, the ability to standardize the imagination of continents. A Spanish soldier in Mexico watched as a local artisan carved a feathered serpent into the base of a newly cast church bell. This was not an act of devotion to the old gods, but a subtle act of defiance, a quiet reclamation of a stolen story. The exchange networks that once facilitated mutual understanding now carried a darker cargo, myths weaponized for conquest and control. Colonial encounters transformed these ancient pathways into instruments of power, where narratives were imposed to legitimize domination and, in turn, were secretly reshaped into tools of cultural survival. Historians such as Inga Clendenin have detailed how Spanish conquistadors deliberately exploited the Aztec myth of Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent god prophesied to return from the east. When Cortés and his men arrived from the Eastern Sea, their timing and appearance were tragically perfect. The Spanish actively promoted this interpretation, using the existing myth to frame their invasion not as a brutal conquest, but as a destined, almost peaceful transfer of power. This was mythological strategy on a grand scale, a deliberate use of a local belief system to facilitate land seizure and establish trade monopolies under a veneer of divine right. The same pattern unfolded across the globe with the British East India Company. As the company tightened its economic grip on India, it systematically promoted English legends and historical narratives, positioning them as superior to local epics like the Ramayana. This was not merely cultural exchange, it was a calculated effort to undermine indigenous authority and make colonial rule appear inevitable and morally justified. Trade routes once traveled by merchants were now patrolled by missionaries who carried Bibles alongside ledgers, spreading a colonial gospel that served to pacify and control. Yet this was never a one-way street. The very myths used as chains of control were often forged into keys for resistance. Enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and the Americas, stripped of their freedom, performed a breathtaking act of mythological synthesis. Within the rigid structures of imposed Catholicism, they secretly preserved their own spirits and deities. In religions like Vodou, the powerful Yoruba spirit of storms and justice, Shango, was seamlessly identified with Saint Barbara. To the colonial authorities, it appeared as veneration of a Catholic saint. To the initiated, it was the continued worship of an ancestral force. This was not a loss of culture, but its brilliant, hidden evolution. An artisan forced to carve a Christian saint for a colonial church might subtly incorporate the symbols of a local river spirit into the saint's robes. A song sung in a plantation field, seemingly a Christian hymn, could contain coded lyrics referencing a myth of liberation and return to a homeland. These acts created a double narrative, one for the masters and one for the people, allowing subjugated cultures to maintain their identity under immense pressure. Why did this reinterpretation prove so powerful? Because myth, at its core, is about meaning. When a people's world is shattered, the stories they tell themselves become a means of reassembling the pieces into a new, survivable whole. The colonial exchange of myths was steeped in profound hardship, yet it also sparked astonishingly creative syntheses, proving that even the most oppressive systems could not fully contain the human need to tell a story that truly belonged to its tellers. The Sumerian farmer listened, his eyes fixed on the priest who spoke of the god Enlil's divine decree. This was not just a story about creation, it was a powerful explanation for why the farmer's portion of the harvest belonged to the temple. Across the ancient world, myths became the primary tool for justifying economic realities, transforming social hierarchies from human inventions into sacred, unchangeable facts. These stories provided a spiritual foundation for the entire structure of wealth and poverty, a framework that traveled effortlessly along the very exchange networks that made some men rich and kept others in their place. Anthropologist David Graeber explored this deep connection, revealing how the earliest myths often framed the cosmic order in starkly economic terms. The Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, does not merely describe the birth of gods, it describes a universe founded on a system of labor and debt, where the world itself is built from the remains of a vanquished primordial being. This was a template for society, a story that made tribute and taxation seem as natural as the sunrise. In Greece, poets told how Zeus distributed gifts and abilities unevenly among mortals, a narrative that explained why one man was born to rule and another to serve. Far to the east, the intricate layers of the Hindu caste system were supported and sanctified by the Puranic myths, which described the very bodies of different social classes as emerging from separate parts of a primordial cosmic being. This was not just symbolism, it was social engineering on a divine scale. The merchant elites who grew wealthy from long-distance trade understood the power of these narratives. They were often the most ardent patrons of poets and priests, funding the creation of new myths or the embellishment of old ones to promote a worldview that protected their interests. A caravan owner confronted by laborers demanding a greater share of the profits could simply cite a well-known legend about a god's preference for the cunning over the strong. He was not just refusing a pay increase, he was invoking a higher power, a spiritual justification that was far more difficult to challenge than a simple economic argument. Why did these economic myths prove so durable and spread so widely? They provided a crucial form of social stability. In a world without complex legal systems or widespread literacy, a shared belief in a divinely ordained economic order reduced conflict and reinforced the status quo. It made the distribution of wealth feel inevitable, a part of the natural and spiritual world rather than a product of human decisions. The myth told to the farmer in Mesopotamia and the one told to the laborer in the Indus Valley, though different in detail, served the same profound purpose, turning the engine of commerce into a sacred, unquestionable force. That bundle of seeds was a living library containing not just future grain but the entire story of its birth. When a farmer in ancient Egypt traded emmer wheat to a Nubian merchant, he was not merely bartering food, he was transferring a piece of his worldview, a mythic explanation for why the Nile flooded and how the god Osiris brought life from the black soil. The exchange of crops was one of humanity's most profound conversations, and the stories that traveled with them were the essential instructions for their care. Botanists like Jared Diamond observed that the spread of staple plants like wheat and barley from the Fertile Crescent was inseparable from the spread of Near Eastern myths about dying and rising deities, figures who represented the annual miracle of the harvest emerging from the seemingly dead seed. These narratives were not decorative, they were deeply practical. A community adopting a new type of grain needed to know not just how to plant it, but when, and more importantly, why the ritual of planting mattered. The myth of the Greek goddess Demeter and her daughter Persephone, for instance, was a sophisticated agricultural guide disguised as a family drama. The story explained the seasons, with Persephone's time in the underworld representing the barren winter months when seeds lay dormant underground, and her return bringing the spring growth. This myth traveled with the practice of olive cultivation, providing a spiritual framework that timed the pressing of oil to specific points in the divine narrative. Similarly, as maize cultivation spread north from Mesoamerica, it carried with it the creation myth of the hero twins and their struggle with the lords of the underworld, a story that encoded vital knowledge about soil preparation, planting depths, and the sacred importance of the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, growing together. These myths functioned as living calendars and agricultural manuals. A community would time its planting not by a date on a chart, but by the reenactment of a specific mythic event, ensuring their actions were in harmony with the cosmic cycle. Harvest festivals were the culmination of this process, acting as both spiritual celebrations and major trade fairs. At these gatherings, the successful yield was celebrated, surplus was bartered, and the very myths that had ensured the harvest were performed and shared with visitors, who would then carry both the story and samples of the new crop back to their own land. Why did this blend of story and seed prove so resilient? A myth provided a powerful psychological tool for adaptation. Moving a crop into a new environment was a risky venture. By adopting the foreign myth associated with it, a community was not just learning a technique, they were inviting the divine power behind that technique into their own world, creating a spiritual insurance policy for their food security. This practice turned agriculture into the most essential vector of cultural exchange, ensuring that every new field sown with foreign seeds was also a field sown with a new story. The Mesopotamian envoy unrolled a small clay cylinder, its surface carved not with words of law, but with the image of a hero subduing a mythical beast. This was more than a gift, it was a diplomatic key, designed to unlock trust through a story both he and his foreign host understood. Across the ancient world, trade diplomacy relied on this shared vocabulary of mythological archetypes, universal characters that appeared in the stories of every culture along the exchange routes. These were not coincidences. Psychologist Carl Jung suggested these figures are embedded in the very fabric of the human mind, recurring symbols like the wise elder, the trickster, or the great mother that resonate on a level deeper than language. Envoys were rigorously trained in the mythology of partner states for this exact reason. An ambassador from Rome traveling to Egypt would know to frame a proposal by referencing the wisdom of Thoth, knowing his Egyptian counterparts would instantly grasp the symbolic weight of that archetype. On the Silk Road, the culture hero, a figure who brings vital knowledge to humanity, was a particularly potent diplomatic tool. A Chinese official might present a Sogdian merchant with a tapestry depicting a legendary emperor gifting the secrets of silk, implicitly positioning their current trade relationship within that heroic tradition of benevolent exchange. In the Mediterranean, the mother goddess archetype, whether called Isis, Demeter, or Cybele, provided a common ground for forming trade alliances centered on themes of nourishment, protection, and abundance. The exchange of myth-based gifts was the physical manifestation of this understanding. A Hittite king might send an Egyptian pharaoh a ceremonial axe engraved with a storm god, a deity respected in both their pantheons, to symbolize a shared strength against common challenges. The most profound integrations occurred when a trade agreement was sealed not just with a signature, but with a ritual reenactment of a myth known to both parties. Imagine a pact between a seafaring and an agricultural people, concluded by jointly performing a simplified version of a flood legend they both recognized. Why did this reliance on archetypes so effectively reduce the friction of cross-cultural commerce? They created a pre-existing common ground. A merchant did not need to explain his entire worldview. He could simply invoke the trickster hero, and his counterpart, whether in Gaul or India, would understand he was referencing a force of chaotic ingenuity and unpredictable outcomes. This shared symbolic language bypassed linguistic barriers and political suspicions, transforming a potentially hostile negotiation into a conversation between fellow participants in a universal human story. The rhythmic tap of a hammer on metal was more than a sound, it was a prayer. Inside a medieval guild hall, the air thick with the scent of wood and hot wax, artisans did not see themselves as mere workers. They were inheritors of a sacred legacy, their hands guided by the spirits of divine craftsmen whose stories had traveled to them along the very trade routes that supplied their materials. From the forges of the Rhineland to the weaving houses of Flanders, craft guilds adopted powerful mythological patrons, weaving these narratives directly into their identity and output. A blacksmith's guild might take Hephaestus, the limping god of the forge from Greek myth, as their celestial model, while a carpenter's guild in India would look to Vishwakarma, the divine architect of the universe in Hindu tradition. Historian Stephen Epstein notes that these were not casual affiliations. Guilds used the stories of these figures to legitimize their social status, framing their specialized knowledge not as a simple trade secret, but as a fragment of divine wisdom passed down through generations. This spiritual connection was forged through ritual. A young apprentice's initiation could mirror the harrowing journey of a hero from a local saga, a symbolic death and rebirth that marked his transition from outsider to brother in the craft. The guild's very seal, pressed into wax on official documents, was often a miniature masterpiece of mythological art, featuring a scene from their patron's legend that served as both a trademark and a sacred vow of quality. Consider a Venetian glassblower, his breath shaping molten crystal into a delicate vessel. He might deliberately incorporate a local myth about transparent truth into his design philosophy, knowing that this story, when explained to a wealthy buyer in Constantinople, would elevate his product from a simple container to an object of philosophical and spiritual significance. This shared mythological language spread when guilds sent their apprentices to study in distant cities or when masters met at international trade fairs, created an invisible bond of quality and trust that spanned continents. But how did a story about a god actually improve a craftsman's work? It created a spiritual dimension to quality control. To produce a flawed item was not just a commercial failure, it was an insult to the patron deity, a betrayal of the sacred narrative that gave the guild its purpose. This profound sense of obligation fostered both innovation, as masters sought to honor their divine patron through ever greater skill, and consistency, as the myth provided an unchangeable standard of excellence that traveled with the goods, ensuring a sword made in Toledo carried the same legendary promise as one made in Damascus. The myth became the soul of the product, a hidden value that resonated in markets thousands of miles from the workshop where it was first whispered. The Phoenician merchants' hands did not simply offer an ivory statuette, they offered a conduit to the goddess Astarte herself. This was the alchemy of the luxury trade, where rare materials were transformed by the stories they carried, their value magnified by a direct link to the divine. Gold, ivory, and precious gems traveled the exchange networks not as silent treasures, but as vessels brimming with myth their allure carefully crafted to captivate the elite. Art historians like John Boardman have meticulously traced these narratives, finding scenes from the Epic of Gilgamesh engraved on golden cups from Mesopotamia, and the labors of Heracles woven into silk tapestries destined for an Etruscan noble's hall. These objects were more than art, they were spiritual technology for the wealthy, a way to display both immense riches and impeccable piety in a single, breathtaking artifact. Consider the journey of amber from the cold Baltic shores. To the northern tribes who gathered it, this golden material was not just fossilized resin, it was solidified sunlight, a piece of the solar deity's own power. When this amber traveled south along the trade routes to the Mediterranean, that potent myth traveled with it. A Greek aristocrat purchasing an amber necklace was not just buying jewelry, he was acquiring a fragment of a distant sun god's legend, a story that added an incalculable layer of value to the already precious material. Similarly, in China, jade was not valued for its beauty alone. It was inextricably linked to tales of immortality and cosmic power, a belief that made certain shades of jade more desirable than gold itself and fueled a trade network stretching deep into Central Asia. This process relied heavily on royal patronage. A king did not merely commission a golden throne, he commissioned a myth. He would order his artisans to inlay it with ivory plaques depicting his supposed descent from a hero like Gilgamesh, or to carve its arms with scenes of a god granting him authority. By sitting on this throne, he was physically enacting the myth, using the object to assert his divine right to rule. This same principle elevated luxury items into the ultimate diplomatic gifts. A pharaoh might send a chest of gold vessels adorned with the story of Osiris to a Hittite king, a gift that said, "I possess the favor of the gods, and by accepting this, you acknowledge our shared celestial bond." Why did this fusion of myth and material prove so irresistible across cultures? A luxury item without a story was merely a display of wealth, but one with a myth became a tangible connection to the cosmos. It allowed an elite individual to own not just a thing, but a piece of a sacred narrative, a physical anchor for their beliefs and ambitions. This deep, symbolic craving is what drove demand along every exchange network, ensuring that the most valuable cargo was always the story etched into its surface. The priestess of Inanna held the fine linen not as a merchant would, but as a keeper of stories, her hands a bridge between the temple's wealth and the goddess' epic journey into the underworld. While kings and merchants dominate the historical record, women were the often unseen architects of mythological exchange, weaving belief into the very fabric of trade. As priestesses, they managed the sacred storerooms of Sumer, distributing temple textiles and grain while recounting the tales of Inanna's power, their economic authority inseparable from their spiritual role. In Rome, the Vestal Virgins safeguarded the state's most vital contracts and wills, their presence sanctifying the city's commercial and legal foundations. Across the Sahara, female traders in West Africa carried not only gold and salt but the vibrant legends of the Yoruba Orishas, their caravans becoming moving libraries of oral tradition. Feminist scholars like Marija Gimbutas have traced how the myths of powerful goddesses, figures of creation and sovereignty, moved along kinship and trade routes, often carried by women themselves. In Minoan Crete, women traded pottery adorned with symbols of nature deities, spreading a vision of the divine that was intimately connected to the earth. Along the Silk Road, Buddhist nuns traveled perilous routes alongside merchants, their very presence helping to carry sutras and parables into new territories, diversifying the spiritual landscape. This influence extended into the practical rhythms of life. Myths surrounding the cycles of the moon and the female body were sometimes used to regulate market schedules, linking economic time to a deeper, natural rhythm. In some cultures, matriarchal creation stories directly influenced trade laws, emphasizing communal wealth and reciprocity over mere accumulation. A merchant mother teaching her daughter would pass down a dual inheritance, the skill of assessing a gem's value and the story of how the world was sung into existence by a primordial goddess. How did these narratives diversify the myths in circulation? By ensuring that the intimate, the communal, and the cyclical were given a voice alongside the epic tales of kings and conquests. The exchange networks threaded with their efforts carried not a single story of humanity but a chorus. A merchant in the great city of Teotihuacan held up a clay figurine, its face a fusion of the local storm god Tlaloc and a feathered serpent from distant Maya land. This was not confusion but creativity. Dense urban centers were the ultimate workshops for myth, where the stories arriving on trade routes were melted down and recast to serve the needs of a new, mixed population. In the crowded streets of Babylon, Alexandria, and Angkor Wat, a pressing question emerged. How could you foster a sense of shared identity among people from a dozen different cultures, all living and trading on top of one another? The answer was often found in a deliberate, strategic synthesis of belief. Urban thinkers like Lewis Mumford observed that city life naturally generated myths dealing with order and chaos, themes that resonated deeply with the daily experience of navigating a complex, sometimes overwhelming, social world. One powerful mechanism for this was the establishment of multi-deity temples in major trading ports. Imagine a merchant from India arriving in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. He could walk into a temple and find a statue of Serapis, a deity deliberately crafted by Ptolemaic rulers to combine aspects of the Egyptian god Osiris with the Greek god Zeus. This was a theological innovation designed for urban life, offering a familiar face of divinity to people from multiple traditions and encouraging a shared civic piety. Another method was the rewriting of a city's own origin story. Rome's founding myth, for instance, was famously adjusted to include the Trojan hero Aeneas as an ancestor. This was a brilliant diplomatic move, creating a legendary kinship with Greek colonies across the Mediterranean and easing the path for trade and political alliance. How did these newly forged urban myths directly grease the wheels of commerce? They created a layer of shared identity that reduced the inherent suspicion between strangers in a bustling marketplace. A trader from Carthage and a merchant from Rome might have deep political tensions, but if they both did business in a city that honored a blended pantheon, they could find common ground in a shared ritual or a mutually understood story. This mythological common ground was a social lubricant, transforming a potentially hostile negotiation into a transaction between people who, at least in the realm of the sacred, belonged to the same spiritual city. It promoted economic integration by making the foreign feel less threatening, allowing goods and capital to flow more freely through the veins of the ancient world's greatest metropolises. A merchant in Renaissance Florence meticulously entered numbers into his ledger, the ink precise and unsentimental. The small wooden statue of Mercury, the Roman god of commerce, sat dusty on a nearby shelf, its presence now more a habit than a necessity. This quiet shift marked the beginning of a great unraveling, a slow process where the ancient threads binding myth to commerce began to fray. The rise of secular institutions and a new, scientific way of thinking started to untangle belief from business, transferring trust from the gods to contracts, from temples to banks. Historians like Max Weber would later call this the disenchantment of the world, a transition where economic rationality began to overshadow the mythological frameworks that had guided trade for millennia. One of the most significant changes was the replacement of temple loans with state-backed banks, where a Mesopotamian merchant once secured a loan with a sacred vow to a priest of Enlil. A Venetian trader now signed a legally binding document in a secular building, its authority derived from civil law, not divine will. Similarly, international trade agreements began to cite concepts of natural law and mutually assured profit instead of invoking a pantheon of deities to enforce the terms. A trader in 18th century London would consult a printed credit report and actuarial tables to assess risk, rather than seeking omens from an augur interpreting the flight of birds. Why did this profound shift occur? The sheer scale and complexity of global trade demanded systems that were predictable, standardized, and enforceable across diverse cultures with conflicting beliefs. A contract based on universal commercial principles could be understood in Amsterdam and Canton, while a myth known only in one region lost its power to bind strangers. Yet the old ways did not vanish entirely. They persisted in symbolic echoes. The coats of arms above merchant guilds still featured lions and eagles, mythical beasts that once signified divine favor. The winged helm of Mercury evolved into the modern logo for shipping and financial services, a ghost of the god haunting the very system that replaced him. This transition reshaped our entire perception of value and risk, moving it from a sacred cosmos to a calculable market. But the human need for a story behind the transaction never truly disappeared. It simply found new, quieter forms. A modern influencer shares a viral story, their screen a glowing marketplace for ideas that mirrors the ancient agora. Our digital networks are the new exchange routes, with platforms connecting myths, commerce, and community in ways that would feel deeply familiar to a Mesopotamian merchant. Algorithms now act as the high priests of these new temples, curating the stories we see and shaping the beliefs we hold, while e-commerce sites function as the storehouses of this digital age. Tech thinkers like Yuval Noah Harari point to the power of digital myths, the compelling origin stories that tech founders tell about their companies, which function much like ancient foundation legends to build fierce brand loyalty and a sense of shared purpose among users. Consider the spread of modern conspiracy narratives. These stories travel not along caravan trails, but through online trade forums and social media groups, where shared belief creates tight-knit communities and can even influence real-world market behavior, like the coordinated trading of certain stocks. In a more positive light, crowdfunding campaigns for new products often rely on powerful mythological storytelling. A creator does not just present a new gadget, they narrate a heroic quest to overcome an industry giant or to bring a revolutionary vision to life, inviting backers to become part of that modern legend. Data has become the sacred commodity of this new era, a resource mined and traded by platforms with a reverence once reserved for temple offerings. And new digital rituals have emerged, like the unboxing video, where the careful unveiling of a product transforms a simple delivery into a ceremonial experience, a personal celebration of acquisition shared with a global community. Picture a cryptocurrency trader explaining their investment. They rarely cite just the technical specifications of the blockchain. More often, they invoke a powerful myth of decentralized freedom and liberation from traditional financial systems, a narrative that gives their financial decision profound philosophical weight. Why do these patterns of blending belief and business feel so persistent? Because the human mind is wired to find meaning in narrative, to connect through shared stories. Recognizing these ancient rhythms in our modern digital lives gives us a powerful lens. It helps us understand the hidden currents shaping our online world, allowing us to navigate this new myth-saturated landscape not just as consumers, but as conscious participants in an age-old exchange. The Polynesian navigator's hand closed around a piece of obsidian, its sharp edges forged in the heart of a volcano. As he offered it in trade, he did not simply name a price. He spoke of Peel, the goddess whose fiery breath built the islands and whose temper could shatter the land. This was more than a story, it was a vital piece of data. The exchange networks of the ancient world pulsed with these environmental myths, narratives that carried coded instructions for survival and forged a direct link between commerce and ecological awareness. Myths about river deities, forest spirits, and mountain gods were not mere superstition. They were sophisticated systems of traditional knowledge, perfectly packaged for oral transmission along trade routes. Philosopher and ecologist David Abram suggests these stories created a world where nature was not an inert resource to be exploited, but a living, communicative presence. A merchant traveling a river would learn the local tale of the water spirit who demanded respect, a narrative that implicitly taught the seasonal patterns of floods and droughts, ensuring safe passage and sustainable use. In the Amazon basin, the rubber trade of later centuries carried with it indigenous myths of the forest as a vast, sentient being. These stories, rich with descriptions of plant and animal relationships, encoded profound understanding of biodiversity. They explained why certain trees should not be felled and which vines could be harvested without harming the whole. Similarly, in the Norse world, the great world tree Yggdrasil was not just a cosmic symbol. Its myth regulated the timber trade, with certain groves considered sacred and untouchable, effectively creating the first protected forests through narrative taboos. For an individual trader, these myths provided a powerful, internalized check on their actions. A merchant might choose to avoid overharvesting a particular medicinal root not because of a written law, but from a deeply held story about the mountain god who guarded it, a deity known for harsh vengeance against the greedy. This mythological framework ensured that commerce did not completely strip the land, preserving the very resources that made trade possible for generations. Why do these ancient stories hold such relevance for our modern efforts in sustainable trade? They remind us that long before certification seals and carbon credits, humanity used the most powerful tool at its disposal, the story, to maintain a balance. They teach us that commerce has always been a conversation with our environment, and the myths we choose to believe about nature will ultimately determine what we value and what we preserve. A digital merchant in a virtual agora adjusts the holographic emblem above her stall, an ever-shifting symbol that an algorithm designed to resonate with your specific cultural background. This is the next frontier of mythological exchange, a world where technology does not just transmit stories, but actively generates them, crafting new narratives for a hyper-connected global marketplace. As our exchange networks evolve into digital and eventually interplanetary realms, the ancient dance between belief and commerce is entering a phase of unprecedented transformation. Futurists like Amy Webb point to emerging technologies like digital twins, perfect virtual replicas of physical spaces. Imagine a digital twin of the Parthenon or the temple at Karnak, not as a silent museum piece, but as a living, interactive host for global myth exchanges. Visitors from anywhere could bring their local stories into this shared sacred space, witnessing them blend and interact in real time to form new hybrid legends. Artificial intelligence is poised to become the new multilingual merchant of myth. An AI could analyze the deep narrative structures of thousands of cultural traditions, then generate a brand new story about a hero's journey that feels instinctively familiar to someone in Mumbai, while also carrying resonant themes for a viewer in Buenos Aires. This story could then be used as the foundational myth for a new virtual product or a global brand, its narrative tailored for maximum cultural appeal. Blockchain networks, the secure ledgers of the digital age, might adopt mythological symbols for their very architecture. A transaction could be secured not by a string of numbers, but by invoking the unbreakable oath of a god, embedding ancient concepts of sacred trust into the code that underpins modern commerce. As we look beyond our planet, the potential expands further. The first trade missions to Mars will carry more than hydroponic equipment and solar panels. They will carry our earthly myths. We can already envision a Martian colony adapting the story of Demeter's grief to explain the long, barren winters on the Red Planet, or creating new heroes who wrestle with the planet's ancient, silent valleys. What new myths will arise from the experience of seeing Earth as a pale blue dot in the void? The ethical questions are profound. When myths can be algorithmically generated and commodified, who owns a story? What happens when a sacred narrative from a vulnerable culture is scanned, repackaged, and sold as entertainment in a virtual marketplace without context or consent? This hyperconnection demands a new level of cultural sensitivity, a digital version of the respect that ancient merchants showed when introducing a foreign deity to a new land. The core truth, however, remains unchanged. Our drive to build exchange networks is inextricably linked to our need to share stories. Whether along a dusty Silk Road or a fiber optic cable, the most valuable cargo has always been the narrative that gives meaning to the journey itself. From the golden amber routes to the glowing digital platforms, we have traced a web connecting temples, markets, and myths. This journey reveals a profound truth that trade was never solely about material gain. It has always been a current carrying our deepest beliefs and stories across continents, shaping who we are and how we understand one another. Think of the merchant whose simple coins spread the image of a distant god, or the pilgrim whose footsteps of faith funded the spread of a new legend. These were not separate acts of commerce and spirit, but two sides of a single human impulse to connect and create meaning. As you reflect on this intricate tapestry, consider the myths that circulate in your own life. The founding story of your company, the tale of how your family came to be where it is, the shared narrative of your local community. Each of these has traveled along its own network of exchange, shaped by the connections you engage with every day. The enduring lesson is that commerce and narrative are forever intertwined, one fueling the other in an endless dance. We invite you to share in the comments a myth that has journeyed through your own family or community, a story that found a home because someone traveled, traded, or told a tale. Subscribe to continue exploring the hidden histories that shape our world, for in the end, our shared stories remain the most valuable currency we will